So welcome everybody. Glad to be with you here today. My name is Cindy Cook and I am the new executive director of the Friends. I came on board in February. Have had a great time over the last 8 months getting to know all kinds of our members, library staff, folks in the community who support libraries. To start off this morning, I want to thank our sponsors for this event, Mary and Dick Fowler. If you could give a little wave. Mary Fowler, thank you for helping us to bring interesting and engaging Minnesota authors to this lovely setting. I also want to introduce a few other folks to you. So today we have many of our board members here. So if the board members could just stand and give a little wave. Yeah, come on, board members, give a little wave. Thank you. Thank you. We have a very active board of directors who really help to keep this organization humming. Also want to introduce library board member Marisol Chiclana Ayala is here today with us, and give her a little round of applause. Marisol will be the new liaison to the Friends Board of Directors from the Library Board, so we're excited to have her start in that role. Also want to introduce the Ramsey County Library Director, Jill Boldenau is here, along with the Deputy Director, Lynn Wyman. Where are you, Lynn? I know I saw you earlier. There she is. So make sure you get to know a few people, chat, get to know them, give them your ideas and suggestions. A few people have given me some suggestions so far that I'll be taking right back to the library. So moving on, I want to introduce the person who will introduce the authors. That's who you're here to see. So I want to introduce Lynn Bhauja. She is an attorney in the Minnesota Department of Health Legal Unit and is the Minnesota Department of Health Data Practices Coordinator and Data Practices Compliance Official. So you know that serving on our board as well, she also helps us cross our T's and dot our I's. She is in her second term as treasurer of the Minnesota State Bar Association's Public Law Section Executive Council, which is a mouthful, and is co-chair of the Public Law Section Data Practices Committee. Lynn has served on our board of directors since 2009 and is the chair of our membership committee. And under her leadership with the membership committee, we have grown from 217 households to more than 840 households today. So please welcome Lynn Bhauja.
Thanks, Cindy, for that introduction. I'm afraid that I'm going to probably read most of this because I hated what I had last night, and so I completely rewrote it. But you'll be happy because I made it much shorter. All right, I'm delighted to introduce our author program today. We have two accomplished storytellers. Erin Hart, who weaves the music of Irish poetry and song into her wonderful mystery novels, and Paddy O'Brien, who tells the stories as he plays the traditional Irish tunes he has collected since his childhood. Erin Hart is a theater critic and former administrator at the Minnesota State Arts Board. A lifelong interest in Irish traditional music inspired her to co-found the Irish Music and Dance Association here in Minnesota. While visiting friends in Ireland one summer, she heard a story about a red-haired girl whose perfectly preserved head was discovered in an Irish bog. That was the inspiration for Erin's debut mystery novel, Haunted Ground. Do you remember the Colleen Rua? The Colleen Rua. Published in 2003, Haunted Ground was nominated for both the Agatha and Anthony Awards for Best First Novel and introduced her two main characters, Nora Gavin, an American pathologist, and Cormac McGuire, an Irish archaeologist. Her second novel, Lake of Sorrows, was a 2004 Minnesota Book Award finalist, and the next, False Mermaid, was named one of the top 10 crime novels of 2010 by ALA Booklist. Her most recent novel, The Book of Killowen, was a 2013 Minnesota Book Award finalist. Erin's husband, Paddy O'Brien, now here's where it gets dicey because I may have to say Irish words. And I was okay with Killowen because that makes sense to me. So forgive me, I'll throw myself on your mercy. Paddy O'Brien has been called a button box wizard and a living treasure trove of Irish traditional music. His musical career spans more than 50 years. His mastery of the two-row button box accordion has been acknowledged by awards too numerous for me to mention, and most of them so authentically Irish that I don't have a chance of pronouncing them properly. But I will say, 4 times, he was named Erechtes Champion. Okay. In addition, he is a musical historian. In 1995, Paddy started a tremendous project in Irish traditional music to record and collect background stories on 500 jigs and reels from his repertoire. The result of that effort is the Paddy O'Brien Tune Collection, a personal treasury of Irish traditional music, now 3 volumes comprising 1,500 tunes. Paddy was named Irish Traditional Composer of the Year in 2012. Also in 2012, he finally listened to friends and colleagues who kept telling him, "You have great stories. When are you going to write a book?" The result was Paddy's memoir, The Road from Castlebarnagh, Growing Up in Irish Music, the stories of his growing up as a young musician in County Offaly in the 1950s and 60s. Please help me welcome Erin Hart and Paddy O'Brien.
Well, that rewrite worked, I'd say. That was great. Thank you to Lynn, thank you to Jill, thank you to Caitlin, who's here, and to Kathy, who first invited us to be part of the Friends Lunch. We are thrilled to be here. I see the Friends groups all around the country as the backbone of our civilization, so give yourself a big round of applause for that. We do kind of a double act here, so I'm just introducing us, and then Paddy will tell you a little bit about how he came to write his story, The Road from Castlebarnagh, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my latest novel, The Book of Killowen. We have some pictures to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, and we hope that you feel very relaxed, as if you're sitting beside an Irish fireside on a nice fall day. And if you have any questions, too, we'd love to answer them. So please raise your hand, or maybe at the end we can take some questions if we have some time for that. So we'd love questions from people. So Paddy, are you ready to take it away?
Yeah.
All right, terrific. Put your book up there.
I hate doing this. I never get used to it. Anyway, this is the book, and it started off one evening. I was thinking about people writing books, and I had read a good few, and I was always fascinated about people that write books with 300 and 400 pages, and there's so many words, and how could they keep going writing a whole book? And so I took up the biro pen one evening, and I just out of curiosity, and I started writing a story, and I wrote it, and then I wrote another story, and before the evening was over, I had about 30 pages done, And I said to myself, this is not too bad. It's easier than I thought. But it was easy in the sense that I had all these stories in my head, and all I had to do really is write them down. And but I also, had to construct them in a way that people would recognise, what the story meant in terms of its culture, the cultural background, and that. And I suppose the book is about how I got into playing a musical instrument, and I will read one chapter here about how I got my first musical instrument. I must have been about 10 years old. But there are other stories as well, about hauling water to the house and collecting firewood, and helping my father. He thatched our house for the first time. Thatching means you put a new layer of straw on the roof, and that was an interesting exercise, and there was a lot of things involved that would be, I suppose, be looked upon nowadays as a kind of workmanship, that's out of date. But my father adapted very well, and we got a whole lorry load of oaten straw from a neighbour, and we borrowed a big long ladder, and I had to haul the water. I also had to provide scallops, And we used to make these you know what scallops are? They're like sally rods, you know. And you make them you bend them, you know, by holding them to the fire midway, and you soften them and then make them into a U sign. And that's where you pin down the straw on the roof with these things. But there was a lot of that kind of work, and a lot of pulling straw and a lot of swearing. But anyway, there was lots of things. Well, our house inside there, you know, it was just a plain hearth fire. There was no grate or anything like that. The fire was on the floor, up against the wall, you know. And if you stand or stood near the fire, you could look up into the chimney. And I remember one Christmas, my father swept the chimney, which was a tall order that hadn't been swept in maybe 15 or 20 years. And so it was Christmas, and he got rid of all this soot, and the whole chimney became wider, you know, and you could stand in and look up, and you could see the moon and the stars, you know. And my sisters were expecting Santa Claus, and there was great excitement over that, you know. And, and of course, the next day, there were toys delivered to our house somehow. There was toys there, but my sisters were convinced it was Santa Claus that did it. And I remember Anne, one of my sisters, she was out looking at the roof of the house, looking for the marks of the sleigh, you know, to see was there any, did Santa Claus leave any of this tracks on the roof, you know, from the visit. Anyway, these are just bits of little memories, you know. There was some great times sitting around the fireplace, you know, at night, gathered, telling stories, you know, and a lot of ghost stories. I remember going to bed, you know, at night, holding a candle, going into the dark room, and I was petrified, having heard several ghost stories from a visiting neighbour. So that was the entertainment, you know. In the late 40s and the 1950s, we didn't have any radio, we didn't have any wireless or electricity, nothing, no running water, you know, it was all very primitive. But there was great camaraderie, you know, among the neighbours and everybody around the locality. You know, there was every family had at least 5, 6, 7 or more children, you know, and there was always great gaiety, I suppose you could call it, in the countryside, listening to children in the distance and screeching and shouting, enjoying themselves and playing games and stuff like that, as we were too. But there was also a lot of work and chores, and, you know, I used to have to provide a lot of what they call firing for the fire to keep the fire going, and particularly I had to get bring in lots of dried up twigs and things like that for my father, so that he could easily start the fire in the morning. He'd be up about 6 o'clock and he'd be gone by 7, you know. And anyway, I'll read you just one story here. Like, I mean, there's so much that went on at that time. But there's about 64 stories in this. And this one now is called Hairpins and Combs, and it's about a peddler that used to travel around our locality with a donkey and cart, and he used to be selling all sorts of accoutrements, you know, household appliances. And anyway, I'll read it. It was early spring in 1953 when I was sent outside in search of sticks, or firing, as my father would say. This was firewood that had to be gathered and brought home to our kitchen to dry by the fire. Much of it was small twigs, which were used for kindling and of enormous help in starting a fire. It was usually my job to keep my father supplied with enough of this firing, and any neglect of my duty meant an uncomfortable scolding. One afternoon, when returning with an armful of kindling, I spotted a black donkey and cart outside our gate. The cart had no sideboards. A sack full of something lay near its tail end, and several implements for farm work lay on the floor of the cart. Pitchforks, spades, shovels, and iron picks with their separate handles made of fresh ash. The man in charge was tying his donkey to our iron gate beside the road. Going back behind his cart, he unloaded a sack full of curios and hoisted it onto his shoulder. As I neared the door of our house, I saw that he had beaten me to it and was already talking to my mother. "Well, Jim," she said, "come in, let's see what you have." I followed him inside and put my own load in the corner by the fire. He unloaded his sack onto the cement floor. Opening its neck revealed a bunch of articles I recognised as mouse traps, spools of thread and rat traps. But when he turned the sack upside down, I was astounded at the range of his other items: hairpins, brushes, combs, candles, Clark's tin whistles, rings for ringing the snouts of pigs, rattles for small children, shoelaces and mouth organs. I ran to my mother when I saw the mouth organs. Mammy, get me one, I begged. And she did, for 1 shilling. And so began my musical career. She bought a few other accoutrements as well: candles and St. Patrick's Day badges. When the pedlar began his departure, I saw that he was a tall, lanky man wearing a peaked cap and long grey tweed topcoat. Some of its buttons were missing, and it was held together at the waist by binding twine instead of a belt. He had a hooked nose and small dark eyes, almost like a Neil's. His Adam's apple stuck out, and his hands had very long fingernails, which my mother liked because this suggested he had an even temper, one of the many old wives' tales of which my mother had a store. She was later put on the defensive regarding the length of the pedlar's nails after he untied his donkey and climbed onto the front of the cart. With the reins in each hand, he gave them a short thug. "Get up there, Bosco," he shouted at the donkey. The donkey stood motionless. The pedlar roared and shouted, "Get up, get up." But Bosco the donkey stood still. Jim the pedlar reached behind him and grabbed a pick handle. "Now," he says, "what do you think of this, you miserable bag of glue?" He began beating the donkey's rump and was beginning to sweat himself into a frenzy when my mother came running up to the gate. "Stop, stop," she yelled. "Jim, I'm surprised at you. This is cruelty, stop it." She had a basin full of chopped turnips, which she was preparing for dinner. "Let me try a little bit of kindness," she said. "It goes a long way." She stepped outside the gate and pushed the basin of turnips under the donkey's mouth. I was standing nearby and began testing the mouth organ, hooting it and running it back and forth against my mouth. Bosco was probing at the turnips, but then he turned his head in my direction and his ears stood to attention. In 2 seconds he plunged forward and jerked the cart up the small hill, and he started to run. The pedlar's cap tumbled from his head when he was suddenly pulled forward. I was still puffing at my mouth organ, a 10-year-old boy who didn't know that his music had frightened the dumb animal out of its wits. I continued to blow into the instrument, and walking up onto the roadside, I was just in time to see the donkey and cart disappear around a turn in the road. That was the last time I saw them. It was a story that was told over and over, in front of many a heart in our locality. And so people would talk about things like that, every little happening, you could make up a story, and people would, be delighted to hear a new story, good or bad. Anyway, will I do more? Yeah. I have another short little bit. Another thing we used to do was have house dances, and usually in the kitchen. And we would remove the furniture, the table just about everything, chairs, and well, there'd be a few chairs left there for the musicians. But anyway, we had one of these house dances, and it was great fun. And we were only about, I'd say, 8 or 9, myself and my sister. The following winter, we hosted a house dance and invited 2 accordion players and a fiddler to provide some music. My father said he would beat his tambourine. It was on a Sunday night, and we turned up our oil lamp and added a couple of candles to give extra light in the kitchen. Sandwiches were made with sardines and ham. Armfuls of turf were stuffed into a bin, and an extra kettle was brought along by one of my aunts. A tall, dark man with a brown hat played a whole black dot accordion. His name was Paddy McGrath, and he was noted as a good player. A second accordion, a red-coloured C-sharp D Paulo soprani, was played by Mick Hayes. The fiddler was a friend of our family, a very generous, very shy man known to us children as Dinny. His last name was Doyle, and his place of abode was a half-mile north of our house beside the banks of the Grand Canal. I never heard him play by himself and didn't know until that evening that he had a fiddle. The 3 of them began playing together at about 8 o'clock. I was sitting in my chosen spot in the corner by the fire. It was a good vantage point, and I felt awfully happy as I waited for the proceedings to develop. My sister Moira was sitting near me, and I could see her eyes open wider as the music was played. We had never heard musicians playing together like this, and were convinced afterwards that it was better than the wireless. There were 14 people, not counting my parents and the 3 musicians. And as the music was played, 4 couples began waltzing around the floor. My sister and I were watching our aunts and their men laughing and joking. Myra and I thought they looked funny on account of not having seen them dance before. Soon other people took to the floor, and in a short time the kitchen was crowded with people. Later on in the evening, tea and sandwiches were provided. This gave the musicians a break, but it didn't last very long. Soon they began again with another waltz, and 5 couples took the floor while others were calling for a half set. Our kitchen was a small space and could only accommodate 5 or 6 couples at a time. However, everyone had a mighty time, and the highlight of the evening was the half sets danced to reels or polkas. These were my favourites because of the tunes and the basket swinging, which meant a group of 2 fellas and 2 women swinging with their arms entwined about one another in a tight circle. Tom Byrne loved to basket swing, and he would propel the swing until it went out of time with the music, and 1 or 2 people would become dizzy and disconnect from the circle and fall against the wall. Tom himself lost his balance and fell against the dresser, almost knocking over a number of my mother's wedding plates. When the music stopped, my father told everyone to keep calm and to desist from any unnecessary basket swinging during the sets. Anyway, it was common in those days to remind dancers about unruly basket swinging because it ruined the continuity of the dance. When it got out of hand, women would scream and lose their footing on the floor and would be lifted and left hanging out of the bunch as it spun around and around. It reminded me of the swinging chairs at a visiting carnival, which also produced high-pitched screams from young ladies. During a break, a few bottles of porter was produced from somewhere. The musicians were the ones to get the first round, and it energized them greatly. Paddy McGrath removed his hat because he was sweating, and Mick Hayes followed suit. When Paddy reached over and gave me his hat, it made me feel important, and as a kindly gesture, I held it close to the fire to dry. More dancing continued with a Highland fling and then another half set. I heard a lot of different tunes that I hadn't heard before: the Sally Gardens, the Salamanca Reel, and the Echo Hornpipe. An all-time favourite of my father's was also played with all of its 4 parts. It was a jig he drummed into my head for years afterwards. The name of the lark in the morning made me cringe for at least 20 years, until I eventually realised that the tune was a nice piece of music and very well composed. Our house dance lasted until midnight, when everyone began to leave and face the cold night on their bicycles. My sister and I had been escorted to bed an hour or so beforehand. I remember our mother tucking us in and reminding us to go to sleep. Meanwhile, the music carried on, and we could easily hear it through the wall between us and the kitchen. It was long after midnight when we finally fell asleep. Thank you.
When we did our launch of these two books, Paddy told the crowd, he said, the last time I had to speak in front of people, there was a schoolmaster standing over me with a switch. So his bad associations with public speaking, as a lot of people do. Anyway, you can tell that Paddy grew up in a kind of storytelling culture. That was the thing people did for entertainment. They sat by the fire. The neighbors would come and tell what had happened in the locality, whose bull had tried to run him over in the field, and who started cussing when the rain started to fall on the haymaking, and lots of great stories like that. And that was the tradition in Ireland for thousands and thousands of years. That was the way stories from history were passed on, was from father to son. People who were hereditary historians, people who were storytellers and bards would remember these stories. It took them 20 years learning to remember all of the stories of their community. And that was their job, was to remember those and pass them on to the next generation. And so it continues today, even today. And so my story, Book of Killowen, kind of brings up the next tradition, big tradition in Ireland, which was the written word. And Ireland was really famous for that. You've heard of Ireland described as the land of saints and scholars. And it was because Irish monks really filled the libraries of Europe in what we call the Dark Ages, the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, before the printing press was invented. And think of it. Think of living in a time when every single book in the world had been written by hand. Think of that. Think how precious those writings were and how long it took them to do it. So I'm trying to get my slides to go here. So Book of Killowen is based on a true story, like all of my other books as well. I'll just give you a little rundown on them. Haunted Ground began as, I think, was it Cindy said? Lynn. Just reminded me of the story. I heard a friend of mine, I was visiting friends in Ireland, and I had read a poem by Seamus Heaney called Bog Land. There's a line in the poem that says, it's all about things found in bogs. And the line in the poem says, butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered salty and white. And actually it's about 3,000 years, not just 100 years. They found 3,000-year-old butter in the bog, and it still looks like butter in a big wooden keg. You can see it at the National Museum of Ireland. So I didn't know about this butter, and I was astonished at that line in the poem. And so I asked my friend's mother, did you ever hear of people finding butter in the bogs? Is that really true? She said, oh, they find loads of interesting things in the bogs. And she started to tell me about wooden roads from 2,000 years ago, perfectly preserved under the surface of the peat, wooden practice swords from the Middle Ages. And then she said, oh yes, and there's a story about two brothers cutting turf who found the perfectly preserved severed head of a beautiful red-haired girl. I only kept a journal when I was traveling at that time. My journal that night says, thinking of writing a novel about a red-haired girl whose head is found in a bog. Then it says, maybe a movie. I was very cheeky. Ask me what I'd written so far. It was that journal, pretty much, and grocery lists, school papers. But that story just haunted me. I could not get that girl out of my head. Who was she? What was she doing in the bog? Where was the rest of her? What possible reason could she have for being there and only her head. So I started wondering and reading about bogs, and the last entry in the journal is, must find out more about bogs. And as it turned out, my friend's mother had heard this story from her son-in-law, who was the head of archaeology at UCD in Dublin, and his father was also an archaeologist. So the father was called out to this farm where the two brothers had found this girl, and actually they had her head in a biscuit tin on their kitchen table. I hate being an after-dinner speaker, I'm so sorry. And they brought her back to Dublin, and nobody knows what happened to her. So that's yet another mystery in this story, is whatever became of her. I can't find her in any of the lists of bog people who've been found in Ireland. So then my editor asked me, are there going to be bog people in your second book? And I thought, well, yes. So the second book takes place right after the first one, and Cormac and Nora, two main characters, are called out to an industrial bog. And that's where Paddy used to work for 17 years, so that he was a very great source of information and detail for me. It's where they cut peat, loose peat, by the ton, and they ship it to power plants and burn it to generate electricity. So I knew I wanted this different, weird setting in the book. And it also seemed to me that they found lots of artifacts and people in these big bogs. If you go to the National Museum of Ireland, you see beautiful gold necklaces and bracelets. You see bog butter that might have been a sacrifice, might have been an offering to the gods. The people you find in the bogs might have been offerings to the gods as well. So this idea of sacrifice started bubbling through my consciousness. So that's what Lake of Sorrows is about. The place of sacrifice, where these offerings were made, is now being sacrificed to generate electricity. So 98% of the bogs in Ireland are gone. And they will not regenerate unless we wait 10,000 years, because they were growing there for 10,000 years. So that's sort of the theme that runs through this story. And there's always an ancient mystery and a modern mystery. They find a 2,000-year-old man who's been killed in 3 different ways. That's the way they find the human sacrifices. And then they find a guy who's been murdered in the same way, with a blow to the head, a garrote around his neck, and sunk in the bog. And he's wearing a wristwatch, so they know he's not from 2,000 years ago. So there's always a connection between the modern and the ancient mysteries. The third is kind of a departure. False Mermaid takes place mostly in St. Paul, and Nora Gavin comes back to solve the murder of her sister, which happened 5 years previously. And her sweetheart, Cormac, is in the northwest of Ireland, investigating the disappearance of a woman about 100 years ago who was thought to have been a selkie. Anybody know what a selkie is? Few people do. Selkie is usually a seal who sheds her seal skin and becomes a human woman for a time. And when she gets her seal skin back, even though the husband has hidden it away from her in the attic, she must return to the sea, her original home. So it's about having to make a choice of which world are you going to live in, like a mermaid story. And there's shape-shifting involved in it, and identity, questions of identity. And Nora's sister's story has those same kinds of themes. So there's a connection between Cormac's mystery that he's investigating and Nora's that she's working on in St. Paul. So there's always a little kernel of truth. There were lots of women who disappeared, and everybody wonders, did they really return to the sea, or were they done in? So when I came to write Book of Killowen, I thought, what can I possibly use, you know? And things keep turning up in bogs, fortunately, so I never run out of material. So in about 2007, in this bog, a place called Fadden Moor in Tipperary, they're cutting these big blocks of peat moss for gardening. It's not really good for burning. It's kind of pale looking. The dark stuff is better for burning. And so they're cutting these big blocks of peat, setting them out to dry. You can see the scale there. There's my boot. Give you the size of them. That's much bigger than people would use for burning in their fireplaces. And they use big machines. They go down the bank and they cut these blocks and then set them up on top to dry. So one of the guys using a machine there, the guy on the right, Eddie Fogarty, saw something fall out underneath the block of turf or peat that he was cutting. And here's what it looked like. when it landed. Anybody guess what that might be? Oh, I heard it over here. A book. Yes, indeed. It was a book that had been in that spot for 1,000 years. Not perfectly preserved, but partially preserved under the peat. And the workmen kind of peered, they opened it up and they peered inside it. They called the National Museum and said, "We think we found something here that's like the Book of Kells. Look at the lovely decoration on the pages and everything." And so this was huge news. No book had ever been found in a bog before. They'd been preserved, handed down in families, but not found out in nature. And the main thing was, you could still read a little bit of it. So they knew what kind of a book it was. About 3 lines down, right about here, is a line that says, "In vale lacrimarum." Anybody know verses? It's a line from Psalms. So it's Psalm 83. If you look up that in the Vale of Tears, if you look up that line, you'll find that it's Psalm 83. So they knew it was a book of Psalms. And the Psalms would have been really common books for monks to carry around 1,000 years ago. They used them to practice their scribal arts. They memorized them, they sang them. It was a part of their religious practice at the time. So only one little portion was still legible. There you can see it again, "In vale lacrimarum." Here's what the book looked like when it came out of the bog. It's kind of like roast beef hash, with a little bit visible here, and you can see the edges of some pages. And so it took John Gillis from Trinity College Library in Dublin 2.5 years to go through and peel apart all of those wet pages and try and flatten them and dry them without them crumbling into nothing or shriveling up like a wet boot. And it was kind of disintegrating before his eyes, and he had to save as much as he possibly could, but a lot of it was sort of dissolved. There were lots of really interesting looking pages. You can now see this book, or part of it, in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. And the interesting thing was, most of the ink was oak gall ink or iron gall ink. They would mix iron shavings and ground up oak galls, which grow on an oak tree where an insect lays an egg, vitriol, gum arabic to make their basic ink, and it was used right up through the 19th century. And it's not very good on paper because it's so acidic. The tannic acid in the oak gall eats through paper, but it really bites nicely into calfskin vellum. So where the letters were written, the calfskin was preserved by the tannic acid, and where the letters weren't, it dissolved. So you had this alphabet soup effect. And he had to go through with the tweezers and save all of the floating letters in this gelatinous mass. I'm just fascinated by all this. I just can't shut up about it. He was almost more excited about the binding of this book, or it was kind of a folder, really. It wasn't really stitched bound, but it was made of pigskin, and it had 3 buttons, just like books are depicted in the ancient manuscripts. And it was lined with a material he thought he recognized under the microscope, but he wasn't sure what it was. So he sent off a sample and had it tested, and it came back that it was papyrus. So it was the first physical connection between monasteries of Ireland and the monasteries of North Africa. And the Irish monks went everywhere. So they brought, possibly lined this book with papyrus while they were there, and then brought it back to Ireland. So a really interesting, first time ever kind of a find. I don't know if you know about St. John's University still has a book preservation project where they go to the monasteries of Middle East and North Africa, and they're microfilming all of these ancient manuscripts that are in the libraries. And the libraries are threatened there by revolution and war and famines, and the weather is so much drier than it used to be in that area. So they're going around and trying to preserve a lot of these manuscripts. And some are Christian manuscripts and some are Islamic manuscripts as well. So they're doing everything, all of the ancient stuff. So I remembered being back at the National Museum of Ireland doing research for Haunted Ground. They let me into the conservation lab. I was so happy. My archaeologist acquaintance got me in there. And somebody had just brought in an artifact that had been found in the bog. I mean, how lucky was I that that was the day I happened to be there. So here's the technician picking the wet peat off of this thing that was found. And here's what it looked like when he got the peat off. And I remember looking at it and thinking, wow, that looks like a Coach bag from Dayton's. Well, it was about 1,000 years old. And you will never guess where they found it. At a place called Fadden Moor in Tipperary, about only a few yards away from where the book turned up 8 years later. So the archaeologists, you know, they're scientists, so they can't say, oh yes, these things are connected, but I am a novelist and I can put them together. So I started to think, okay, they found a book, they found a satchel, and the monks would carry and store their books in satchels. They were too soft to stand up on a shelf. They didn't use bookcases that time. They would put the book in a satchel, they'd hang it on a peg on the wall, and they would carry it with them when they traveled. If the Vikings came to raid the monastery, they would throw the bags over their shoulders and hightail it over the bog. So I began to think, where's the guy who was carrying this book? How did it end up open, face down, in the bog? So I began to imagine a 9th century man. What would he look like now? This man is actually 2,000 years old, but a 9th century man would look pretty similar. You can't really tell much difference. I thought maybe he would be carrying with him a wax tablet. This is what the monks used to practice their writing as well. This one is from the 7th century and has verses of the Psalms written on it. You can see that at the National Museum as well. So I just dived in. How do they make vellum? You know, how do they make, how do they soak the calf skins and stretch them and make the vellum? How do they do all of the pigments and inks and things like that? And how did they decide what sorts of things to write about? Here's some oak galls. You can see how the insect kind of drills out from the center and then the dry oak gall is left on the tree. They would gather those up and make their ink. They used all kinds of weird things to make inks and pigments, ground up insects to make a kind of a pinkish red. They would use the gall bladders of eels for yellow pigment, and lots of poisonous substances. Anybody ever read The Name of the Rose? Oh, that's really a fun book, medieval scriptoria. And they would make these fantastic manuscripts, beautiful designs. Sometimes the words were hidden in the design, and you had to stare at the page for hours and hours before you could see that there was language there. It was like a mandala. It was a help towards meditation, thinking of God. Here's a page from the Book of Kells. You have no idea how they made these perfect shapes with no magnification in the 9th century. And they wrote down pretty much they copied every piece of writing that they could get their hands on. They went around the world. They collected the work of the Greek philosophers, the Roman philosophers, ethnography, history, geography, natural history, medicine, everything in the world they copied because they knew it was important. They knew that it was necessary to furthering human development and human knowledge. If they found a mistake on a page, they had to copy the mistake. They had to make what was considered a faithful copy. And if they did it wrong, they could be excommunicated, so they were very careful. If there was a hole on the page, sometimes they copied the hole or how the text moved around the hole on the page if somebody didn't, make the vellum right. And they also added some of their own writing. It wasn't just things that they copied. They were also artists themselves. So here's a page of a really long, boring book of Latin grammar. Oh. But at the very end, the person who copied it added a little poem. It says, and it's in Irish language instead of Latin. It says, "A hedge of trees surrounds me. A blackbird's lay sings to me, praise which I will not hide. Above my manuscript, the lined one, the trilling of the birds sings to me. In a gray mantle, the cuckoo sings to me from the tops of bushes. May the Lord protect me from doom. I write well under the green wood." Here's another little poem that's about a cat. It's called Pangur Bond. It's one of the very famous early Christian poems. And it goes, I and Pangur Bond, my cat, 'tis a like task we are at. Hunting mice is his delight. Hunting words I sit all night. It goes on comparing the two of them at their work and what each one of them does. So the monks also complained a lot because, wow, the conditions in those monasteries, really cold, really drafty. One said, do not reproach me concerning the letters. The ink is bad, the parchment scanty, the day dark. 20 days to Easter Monday, and I am cold and tired. These are actual things found in the margins of books. I am Cormac, son of Cosnamoch. There is some devil in this ink. Thin ink, bad vellum, difficult text. This vellum is hairy. And my absolute favorite, now I've written the whole thing, for Christ's sake, give me a drink. Was long days. They complain about how sore their hand is, how their back is just broken with work, 16 hours a day of copying. So these monks were so alive to me. And I thought, I have to have some 9th century monks in my story. So I begin Book of Killowen with a chapter that takes place in the 9th century. And it's a young scribe kind of remembering how he came to that life. And he's traveling across Ireland with his master, and they're stopped at the edge of a bog pool next to an oak forest, and he's up collecting oak galls for their further work. They're working on a book that he calls The Master's Great Work. And so I imagined my 9th century man. There were a couple of pictures there of a car buried in a bog. Paddy knew somebody who didn't have insurance on his car, and he was in an accident, so he buried the car in the bog. And I thought, I'll start with the car buried in a bog, and inside the trunk will be a man from the 9th century. And my writers group said, but how does a 9th century man get into the trunk of a car? I was like, I don't know yet. I have to write the story, and then I'll find out. That's how it happens. And I imagined him carrying a wax tablet, maybe having a satchel with something in it or not. All of these little details. And I thought, I'll set the story kind of in a place that is a modern equivalent of a monastery. So the monasteries in Ireland were working communities. They were farms, they made cheese, they made bread, they raised bees, they worked on scriptoria, they did metal work, they did leather work. They were like little towns of industry. And I imagined my story taking place in a modern equivalent of that, kind of an artist colony, where all of these creative people are gathered together. And as it turned out, the 9th century man in the trunk of the car is not alone. There's somebody in there with him who's only been missing for about 2 months. And his wife is one of the artists who stays at this artist colony where he's found. So she becomes a suspect, and her assistant becomes a suspect. And Cormac and Nora are called out to recover the 9th century man, and they discover this modern person in with him. And there are cheesemakers there, and they raise swans and geese so that they can use the feathers. There's a calligrapher who lives there and is on the staff of this artist colony. And he still uses all of the old techniques, just like Donald Jackson, who made the St. John's Bible. So he was great inspiration to me. I also incorporated the work of a 9th century philosopher who supposedly traveled back to his birthplace in Ireland after being in France and Switzerland for years and years. We're teaching at universities. Nobody knows what happened to him. He disappeared. So that's part of my story as well. And I visited with a curator from the National Museum who talked to me about book shrines and treasures of all kinds. They used to keep these special books that they made in book shrines that were made of yew wood and then wrapped in gold foil and studded with precious stones. And I thought, okay, treasure hunting is definitely a part of the story. So all of these things started to come together in my mind, how to make a modern mystery out of this ancient story and how to connect the present to the ancient monks of Ireland. And it seemed to me when I was finished that all of the characters were somehow connected, like a page from one of these ancient manuscripts, where the head of the creature is here and then the legs get all twisted around all the other creatures and come out the other side of the page. So I'll read you a little bit from the story. And as I said, the younger man, Owen, is up in a tree collecting oak galls, and he's looking down at his master at the edge of the bog pool. Owen looked down from his perch in the tree at the master, still sunning himself by the edge of the bog pool. The oak leaves around him stirred in the breeze, and morning sunlight played on the water, making a golden checkerboard that seemed to move and meld together. And Owen was filled with such an unaccustomed feeling of well-being, his mind combining the contours of the oak leaf with the glinting ripples, all part of the enfolding mysteries of vita aeternum. And he knew exactly what sorts of embellishments he would try out on the page that his master would dictate today. They would argue, and Owen would ask questions. He had become a part of the master's work. He was even allowed to add a gloss from time to time, adding the warmth of his breath to amplify the master's thoughts and words. It was a joyful thing, seeing their two hands on the page side by side. All at once, Owen's thoughts were disturbed by a distant, faint sound of horses approaching. A jagged panic shot through him. From childhood, his first impulse at the prospect of meeting unfriendly stares had always been to hide. And so he climbed higher in the tree, hoping to conceal himself amid its leathery green leaves. As he slipped from sight, a pair of horsemen came charging through the wood, pausing directly below the tree where he was concealed. The forest floor muffled any hoofbeats. All Owen could hear was the squeaking of leather saddles, the rasp of labored breathing. "There he is," the first horseman said to his mate, pointing through the trees at the master. "I confess it's beyond me why anyone should be frightened of such a weak old man." The second rider only grunted. They were so close below Owen that he could smell the rank odor of their bodies. There was an edge in the speaker's voice that said these two were fighting men. They seemed to know his master. What were they after? Owen felt a sudden whirlwind of words in his throat, trying to force their way out, and his first instinct, as always, was to keep them from escaping. He stuffed his fist into his mouth and bit down hard, pain erasing for a brief moment the overpowering need to speak. The first horseman spurred his mount out of the wood and down to the bog's edge, his silent second following. The master turned to them, offering the traditional greeting, "God be with you." In answer, he received a clout across the face that bloodied his lip and robbed him of breath. He staggered slightly, but did not cry out. Hidden in the oak, Owen felt the air around him crackle with danger. He must do something, help the master. But how? "Are you called John?" the first horseman demanded. "After the Baptists," the master replied mildly. "The very same." The first horseman gestured to the leather satchel at the master's feet and exchanged a glance with his mate. "Where's your servant?" "I wish I knew," the master replied. "He disappeared last night, took our store of food. I'm left here with nothing to eat but my own words." He gestured to the satchel on the ground. Owen nearly cried out. He had taken nothing. Why was the master lying? He felt a slowly rising horror as the horsemen dismounted, and each drew a knife from his belt. The pair of them fell upon the old man, thrusting their blades with an upward motion, again and again and again. Over the assassin's shoulders, the master raised his eyes to the tree where Owen crouched, hidden among the leaves. "The beginning and the end," the old man wheezed. "Alpha and Omega." At last the two horsemen stepped back and let the master's lifeless body topple to the ground. Owen could hardly breathe, but he felt the uncontrollable sounds begin to rise within him once more. He bit down on his fist again, this time tasting salty blood. "Shield me, cover me," he prayed to the tall oak, to each of its branches and leaves. "Hide me from the conspiracy of the wicked, from the noisy crowd of evildoers." Suddenly, a third horseman burst through the woods, pulling his beast up short and dismounting beside his fellows. "So you found him. Good." He spat on the master's body. "How goes it for you, heretic? No king to protect you now." The third man snatched up the satchel from the master's feet and looked inside, removing the book he found there and paging through it hungrily before flinging it aside. "Bloody fools!" he shouted. "Amadons! You should have checked the book before you killed him. It's not the one we're after, it's only a bloody psalter." Owen felt the last word like another blow. The psalter was his own, the one he'd copied out for himself. But if the master had his psalter, what was in his own bag? He suddenly felt the weight of the satchel pulling him down like a stone. The third horseman wasn't finished. "What about the idiot servant?" "Gone. We looked everywhere," the first assassin lied. The third man narrowed his eyes, trying to gauge whether his defiant underling spoke the truth. "Well, see that you find him. It shouldn't be too difficult. They say he howls like a banshee." He swung his leg over his horse again. "Now, get rid of the body. See if you can manage to get that right." Owen could only watch as the two men dragged his master out onto the bog. They pushed the body into a dark pool, waiting until it was swallowed up without a sound. Almost as an afterthought, the second horseman reached for the psalter and satchel and flung them into the pool as well. Still hidden in the tree, Owen covered his mouth and wept silently, watching as the open book seemed to float for a few seconds, like a pale pair of wings, and then submerged. So that's my theory about how the book got in the bog. And the underlying theme of this story, too, is also the mystery of language. When the monks started to write words, it was like their secret code. They wrote in Latin, they wrote in Irish. They were the first to write Irish language down. And they wrote down, as I said, everything they could get their hands on. They wrote down their own mythology, Irish myths about Queen Maeve and Finn MacCool, and all of the warriors and heroes and kings and queens of Ireland were written down by Christian monks in the 8th, the 9th, and 10th centuries. Sometimes they would write on the edge of the page, "This is nothing but pagan rubbish." And then they would keep writing the story because it was so good. Because they knew it was important to preserve these things. But they also encoded their language. As I said, they hid language in designs on a page. Only they could understand the written Irish that they wrote their little poems in. So they're like secret messages to their fellow Irish monks who were maybe living in France or Germany or across the world. And all of the people in this story have some sort of connection to language as code. You have Owen in the first chapter, who obviously has something that we call now Tourette's syndrome, where he kind of speaks out of turn and has these verbal and physical tics. And that's talked about a little bit earlier in the chapter that I read you an excerpt from. A character later in the story also has something very similar to that, and so people don't understand him, and he's considered an oddball. Cormac's father has had a stroke, and so he has aphasia, a form of aphasia, and can't make himself understood. He thinks the word in his head, but it doesn't come out of his mouth right. And there's another character who is a Spanish speaker, and so is always searching for the right word in English when she's trying to communicate with people in Ireland. So everybody has some sort of connection to language as secret code, an aid to communication, but also a barrier to communication. And that's kind of the theme that runs under the story as well. So I think we have a little bit of time for, not much, but a couple of questions, if anybody has any for Paddy or me. We'd love to answer them. We'll be out signing books as well, so you can ask them there. Yes, I'm working on my next book, and actually it's not part of this series with Cormac and Nora. It actually takes place, it's historical, so it takes place in the 1930s, but the main character is going to be Nora's grandfather, who's a policeman turned archaeologist, and he's involved in all kinds of political intrigue that was going on in Ireland that time. It's just a short time after their War of Independence, their Civil War, so there's a lot of political, people taking sides on the political spectrum there. And there was a lot of interesting work going on in Ireland as well. The National Museum of Ireland sponsored Harvard University to come and do an an archaeological and sociological survey. So they sent archaeologists, they sent sociologists to study the culture of West Ireland, and physical anthropologists to measure people's heads. And this was a big thing in the early 30s about what race you were based on, facial measurements and the bone size of your bones and all that kind of stuff. Nazis were doing it too, and as well as the Americans. So this is going on in Ireland. This really happened, so I'm incorporating all of those characters who are doing that work into my story. They're working with my character who's an archaeologist. And the guy who was the head of the National Museum Antiquities program at that time was an Austrian who started the Nazi Party of Ireland. And so there was all kinds of things happening that are really interesting to write about. And it's all connected to archaeology and all connected to sociology and customs and marriage and land and all of those things that were big issues at the time. So that's the next story. I'm calling it The Spirit Pool, which is after a place that in the Burren in County Clare. And so it'll be sort of a prequel to the current series, but you'll get hints of what's going to turn up later. And I'm really enjoying the character of Nora's grandfather as well. He's, I think, the one who ended up as a beekeeper in previous books. Thank you again to everyone who invited us. Really a great pleasure to be here with you.
Well, what a wonderful way to spend a Saturday, huh? So let's give another round of applause to Erin and Paddy. So entertaining, so interesting. So anyway, thank you, everybody. Hope you had a great time.